The world often paints a bleak picture of aging alone: dimly lit apartments, silent dinners, and the quiet hum of a television filling the space where conversations once lived. But what if aging solo wasn't a lonely fate, but a powerful, liberating chapter of life? Imagine waking up each day with the freedom to design your own routine, pursuing long-neglected passions, and curating a life filled with meaning, connection, and self-discovery. Aging alone doesn't have to mean loneliness. In fact, it can be an art, a deliberate and fulfilling way of living that embraces independence while nurturing deep connections with the world around you. This is the story of Margaret, a 72-year-old woman who transformed her solo years into the most vibrant and meaningful time of her life. Her journey is not just about survival but about thriving, proving that living independently in later years can be a beautiful and empowering experience. Margaret had always been fiercely independent. A retired teacher with a love for books, art, and morning walks, she had built a life filled with purpose. But when her husband passed away and her children moved across the country, she found herself in an unfamiliar silence. At first, the quiet felt heavy. The absence of daily conversation, shared meals, and spontaneous laughter left a void she wasn't sure how to fill. One evening, as she sat by the window with a cup of tea, she had a realization: her life wasn't over. She wasn't just existing, she had the power to shape this new chapter. Aging alone didn't mean fading away. It meant rediscovering herself. Margaret knew that structure was key. She started her days with a simple but intentional routine. A morning walk through the park, greeting familiar faces. Breakfast with a book, savoring the quiet in a way she had never done before. A new hobby every few months, first painting, then gardening, and later, learning to play the piano. She also made sure to connect with others in ways that felt natural to her. She joined a book club at the local library, where conversations about literature soon turned into deep friendships. She volunteered at a nearby school, tutoring children who reminded her of her early teaching days. Loneliness, she realized, wasn't about being alone. It was about lacking meaningful connections. So Margaret reached out. She rekindled old friendships with handwritten letters, called her children regularly without waiting for them to call first, and even embraced technology, learning how to video chat with her grandchildren. One of her boldest moves was joining a community hiking group for seniors. At first, she was hesitant. Would she keep up? Would she fit in? But she quickly found that adventure had no age limit. She hiked trails she never thought she'd see, exchanged stories with fellow hikers, and felt a sense of belonging stronger than she had in years. Margaret's life wasn't defined by who was around her but by how she chose to fill her days. She built a home that felt warm and inviting, not empty. She took herself out to dinner, traveled alone to places she had always dreamed of visiting, and even adopted a cat named Oliver, whose playful antics filled her home with laughter. Aging alone, she realized, was not about isolation. It was an opportunity to live on her own terms. She was independent, but never lonely. Her days were filled with laughter, learning, and connection. One evening, as she sat by the window again, this time with Oliver curled up beside her, she smiled. Life had not ended when she lost her partner or when her children moved away. It had simply changed. And in that change, she had found something extraordinary, a life fully and beautifully her own. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret was tending to her garden, she noticed a new neighbor moving into the house next door. A man, about her age, with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile, struggled to carry a heavy box up the porch stairs. Instinctively, she walked over. "Need a hand?" she asked, wiping dirt off her gardening gloves. The man chuckled, setting the box down. "I'd be a fool to say no. These books weigh more than I remember." "Books, you say?" Margaret's curiosity piqued. "I'm a bit of a reader myself." He introduced himself as Richard, a retired journalist who had moved to town to be closer to his daughter. Over the next few weeks, their casual greetings turned into longer conversations over the fence. Soon, Margaret found herself looking forward to their chats about travel, literature, and life's twists and turns. One evening, Richard invited her over for dinner. It had been a long time since Margaret had sat across from someone in a candlelit room, sharing a meal made with care. She felt a warmth she hadn't expected, not just from the food, but from the simple joy of companionship. Margaret didn't think of Richard as a replacement for what she had lost. She wasn't searching for that. What she found instead was a new kind of connection, one rooted in mutual respect, laughter, and shared stories. They attended community events together, took evening strolls, and even signed up for a dance class just for fun. But Margaret still cherished her independence. She made it clear she had built a life she loved, and Richard admired that about her. Their friendship blossomed in a way that honored both their individual lives and the joy of having someone to share moments with. At 75, Margaret traveled to Italy, a dream she had put off for years. She walked the streets of Florence, visited art museums, and indulged in pasta and wine without a second thought. When she returned, Richard greeted her at the door with a homemade meal and a dozen questions about her trip. "Next time," he said with a grin, "I just might come with you." Margaret laughed, feeling a quiet sense of contentment. She had spent years fearing what aging alone might mean, only to discover that it was never about being alone at all. It was about choosing how to live. She had created a life filled with passion, connection, and adventure, proving that independence in later years wasn't just possible, it was a gift. As she sat by the window that evening, Oliver curled beside her and a new book in her lap, she smiled. The years ahead were hers to embrace, and she was doing just that. As the months passed, Margaret found herself thriving in ways she never expected. Her friendship with Richard deepened, but it never overshadowed the life she had built for herself. They enjoyed each other's company, but they also respected each other's space. Some evenings, she would curl up with Oliver and a novel, perfectly content in her solitude. Other nights, she and Richard would attend community lectures, go to local jazz performances, or simply sit on her porch sipping tea, talking about the past, present, and all the possibilities still ahead. But life, as always, had its way of throwing unexpected challenges. One chilly afternoon in January, Margaret slipped on an icy patch outside her home. She landed hard, pain shooting up her hip. A neighbor saw her fall and rushed to help, calling an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed a fracture. She would need surgery and several weeks of rehabilitation. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a flicker of fear, not because of the pain, but because she worried about what this meant for her independence. Would she have to rely on others? Would this slow her down? Richard was at the hospital within an hour, pacing in the waiting room. Margaret, half drowsy from pain medication, raised an eyebrow when she saw him. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice groggy but warm. "I know," Richard replied with a small smile. "But I wanted to." Over the next few weeks, Margaret experienced something she hadn't in years, learning to accept help. Her book club friends took turns bringing her home-cooked meals. The neighbors shoveled her walkway. Her daughter flew in for a few days, fussing over her in a way Margaret secretly found comforting. Richard visited almost daily, sometimes reading to her, sometimes just sitting beside her in companionable silence. At first, she resisted the attention. She wasn't used to being the one in need. But slowly, she realized something. Accepting help didn't mean she was losing her independence. It meant she was part of a community, a web of people who cared about her, just as she had cared for others all her life. Margaret's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy was grueling, but she approached it with the same determination she had applied to everything in her life. The first time she took a step without assistance, Richard clapped like she had won a gold medal. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret," he told her. She smiled, gripping her walker. "I know." As she regained her mobility, she also gained a new perspective. She had spent so much time building a life that was rich and full on her own, but she realized now that independence wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about choosing how and when to rely on others. She returned to her routines, but with small adjustments, using a cane for longer walks, allowing a neighbor to help with groceries, and, most importantly, giving herself grace on the days she needed rest. One evening, as she and Richard sat on her porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "I used to think being independent meant never needing anyone," she said. "But maybe it just means knowing when to let people in." Richard nodded. "Exactly. And for what it's worth, I like being one of the people you let in." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth deeper than friendship. She had lived alone. She had faced challenges. She had built a beautiful, independent life. And yet, she had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Aging alone didn't mean being lonely. It meant choosing who to share life with, on her own terms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret felt a quiet peace settle over her. This was her life, full of love, laughter, and endless possibilities. And she was living it fully, every single day. Spring arrived with the scent of blooming lilacs and the promise of renewal. Margaret had fully recovered from her fall, though she still kept a cane nearby for longer walks. She no longer saw it as a symbol of limitation but as a reminder of resilience. One morning, Richard showed up at her doorstep with an excited glint in his eye and a brochure in his hand. "I have an idea," he said, handing it to her. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and studied the cover: Senior Adventure Retreat, Hiking, Kayaking, and Cultural Exploration in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She raised an eyebrow. "Kayaking, Richard? You do remember we're not 25 anymore." He chuckled. "Speak for yourself. I've got plenty of adventure left in me. Besides, you love nature. And we'd be going with a group. No pressure to do anything we don't want to." Margaret hesitated. She had traveled alone before, but the idea of going on an adventure with someone, especially Richard, felt different. Exciting, even. "All right," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Let's do it." A month later, they found themselves surrounded by the breathtaking beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their group was a mix of fellow adventurers in their 60s and 70s, some seasoned travelers, others stepping outside their comfort zones for the first time. Margaret and Richard hiked winding trails, pausing to admire the wildflowers and listen to the birds. She found herself laughing more than she had in years, trading stories with new friends and soaking in the simple joy of shared experiences. Then came the kayaking challenge. As Margaret stood by the lake, life jacket secured, she felt a flicker of doubt. "I haven't done this since my 30s, she admitted. Richard grinned. "Then you're overdue." With a deep breath, she eased into the kayak. At first, her strokes were unsteady, the water feeling foreign beneath her. But soon, she found a rhythm, gliding across the lake as the sun shimmered on the surface. She let out a laugh, pure, uninhibited joy. Richard paddled beside her. "Told you could do it." Margaret shook her head, smiling. "I think I needed to prove it to myself." As the trip came to an end, Margaret and Richard sat around a campfire with their fellow travelers, the stars twinkling above them. Someone played a soft tune on a harmonica, and the night felt warm with companionship. Margaret glanced at Richard, noticing the way the firelight softened his features. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding, a quiet comfort. She had spent years cherishing her independence, wary of letting anyone too close. But this wasn't losing herself. It was gaining something unexpected. As they packed up the next morning, Richard took her hand gently. "Margaret," he said, "I know we both value our space, our freedom. But what if we shared more of it together?" Her heart skipped. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she teased, though her voice was softer now. He nodded. "I don't want to change your life. I just want to be a part of it." Margaret looked at the mountains one last time before turning to Richard. For years, she had feared that growing older meant losing possibilities. But here she was, proving that new beginnings didn't have an age limit. She squeezed his hand. "Let's see where this takes us." Margaret and Richard returned home from the retreat with a quiet understanding between them. There were no grand declarations, no rush to define anything. They simply fell into an easy rhythm: morning walks together, bookshop visits, and slow evenings on the porch, sipping tea as the sky turned dusky pink. Their relationship was different from the whirlwind romances of youth. There was no urgency, no fear of time slipping away. Instead, it was a steady, warm companionship, built on mutual respect and a deep appreciation for each other's independence. But Margaret, ever the pragmatist, found herself thinking, what does this mean for us? One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, she finally voiced the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Richard, do you ever think about, I don't know, making this more official?" She laughed lightly, unsure of how to phrase it. Richard smirked. "Are you proposing to me, Margaret?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. I just mean, do we keep things as they are, or do we take another step forward?" Richard was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "I love my space. And I know you love yours. But I also love being with you. Maybe we don't need a grand gesture. Maybe we just figure out what works for us." And so, that's exactly what they did. Instead of moving in together, they decided on something unconventional, keeping their own homes but spending half the week at each other's place. It was the perfect balance, companionship without losing the independence they both cherished. Margaret found joy in setting up a small bookshelf at Richard's house, filling it with her favorite novels. Richard, in turn, planted a few of her favorite flowers in his garden. Some nights, they cooked dinner together, dancing around the kitchen as jazz played softly in the background. Other nights, they parted ways, each enjoying the solitude of their own space, knowing that come morning, they'd meet for coffee and a walk. And it worked. Aging with purpose, together. Life continued to surprise them. They took small trips, weekend getaways to coastal towns, road trips to places they had always meant to visit but never had. Margaret continued her book club and tutoring, while Richard started writing again, inspired by their travels. They weren't trying to outrun age. They were embracing it fully. Then, one summer evening, as they sat on Margaret's porch watching fireflies dance in the warm air, Richard reached for her hand. "You know," he said, squeezing gently, "I used to think love had to look a certain way. Big commitments, shared houses, all that. But this is the best love I've ever known." Margaret smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. "Me too," she whispered. And just like that, she realized this was her greatest adventure yet. Not because it was grand or extraordinary, but because it was exactly what she wanted. Aging alone had never meant being lonely. It had simply meant choosing how to live, how to love, and how to embrace every moment on her own terms. And she had done just that. Margaret and Richard settled into their unconventional love story with ease. Their days were filled with shared laughter, quiet companionship, and the freedom to live exactly as they pleased. But, as life had taught Margaret time and again, even the most carefully built routines could be shaken by the unexpected. One autumn afternoon, Richard wasn't waiting for her at their usual coffee shop. At first, Margaret brushed it off. Perhaps he had lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, unease settled in her chest. She called his phone. No answer. Trusting her instincts, she drove to his house. The moment she stepped onto his porch and saw the stack of unopened newspapers on his doorstep, her heart clenched. She knocked. No response. Using the spare key he had given her months ago, she let herself in and found him sitting in his armchair, pale and dazed. "Richard." She rushed to his side. He looked up at her, his voice weak but steady. "Margaret, I think I need a little help. Facing mortality, together." A trip to the hospital confirmed it, a mild stroke. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to require rehabilitation. Richard, always the strong and self-sufficient one, was suddenly faced with a reality Margaret knew all too well, needing others. For the first time, it was Margaret helping him. She sat by his hospital bed, reading to him like he had once done for her. She helped him through physical therapy, encouraging him even when frustration flickered in his usually steady eyes. "You're allowed to be frustrated," she told him one evening after a particularly tough session. "But you're not allowed to give up." He gave her a small smile. "Is this what I sounded like when you broke your hip?" "Exactly," she said, squeezing his hand. Over the next few months, Richard regained his strength. But something had shifted between them, an even deeper understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that time was precious. One evening, as they sat on Margaret's porch watching the last golden rays of sunset, Richard took a slow breath. "I used to think aging was about holding on to what we had," he admitted. "But maybe it's more about accepting what changes and choosing who we go through those changes with." Margaret turned to him, her heart full. "And I choose you." Richard smiled. "Then, Margaret, what do you say we make things a little more official?" Her breath caught. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" she teased, echoing the words she had once spoken to him. He nodded. "Let's get married. Not because we have to. Not because it's what people expect. But because I want to spend every day I have left with you, in whatever way life gives us." Margaret, who had never imagined herself walking down an aisle again, felt something warm and undeniable settle in her chest. "Let's do it," she whispered. Their wedding was small, just close friends, family, and a gentle autumn breeze rustling through the trees. Margaret wore a simple blue dress, Richard a sharp navy suit. There was no grand ceremony, no elaborate vows. Just two people, choosing to love each other in their own way. As they exchanged rings, Margaret looked into Richard's eyes, seeing not just the man standing before her, but every version of herself she had been. The widow who feared loneliness, the woman who rebuilt her life, the adventurer who had rediscovered love. And in that moment, she knew, aging wasn't about endings. It was about living, fully and fearlessly, for as long as life allowed. And so, hand in hand, Margaret and Richard stepped into the next chapter, not alone, not afraid, but together. Married life didn't change Margaret and Richard in the way people expected. They still kept their two homes, still spent a few nights apart, still enjoyed their independence. But there was a deeper sense of security now, a quiet comfort in knowing they had officially chosen each other, no matter what lay ahead. Their days were filled with simple joys. They traveled when they could, revisiting places from their past and exploring new ones. They spent afternoons volunteering, Margaret tutoring children at the library, Richard sharing his love of storytelling at the community center. They hosted cozy dinner gatherings for friends, their home filled with warmth and laughter. And then, as time does, life slowed. Richard's health began to decline first. Nothing sudden, just the gradual wear of time. Margaret became his rock, just as he had once been hers. She helped him with his medications, kept track of his appointments, and read to him on the porch as he rested. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Richard took her hand. "I'm not afraid," he said softly, "because I've had a life worth living. And I've had you." Margaret squeezed his hand, blinking back tears. "We've had each other." Richard passed peacefully in his sleep a few months later, in the home they had shared so many memories in. It was a loss, but not a tragedy. Margaret grieved, but she also celebrated the life they had built together. And she continued on, just as she always had. Margaret lived several more years, filling her time with the things she loved, her books, her garden, her friends. She missed Richard, of course, but she never felt alone. She often thought about the life she had once feared, growing old alone, fading into the background. And yet, she had done the exact opposite. She had built a life of meaning, love, and adventure, all on her own terms. One crisp autumn morning, much like the day she had first met Richard, Margaret passed away in her sleep, a book resting on her chest, a peaceful smile on her face. She had lived independently. She had loved deeply. And she had proven, beyond a doubt, that aging alone had never meant being lonely. It had simply meant choosing to live fully, until the very last page. Margaret's story is one of resilience, self-discovery, and unexpected love. After losing her husband and facing life alone, she learned that independence wasn't about isolation, but about shaping life on her own terms. Through friendships, new adventures, and an eventual romance with Richard, she found that aging didn't mean giving up on joy, love, or purpose. Their unconventional love story, one built on mutual respect and a balance of companionship and independence, taught her that love could be redefined at any stage of life. In the end, Margaret lived exactly as she had hoped, freely, fearlessly, and without regrets. And even as she aged, she was never truly alone, because she had chosen a life filled with love in all its forms.